Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. I am Chris Doten, Chief Innovation Officer for the National Democratic Institute, NDI, and I am delighted to welcome you all to the final NDI Tech Summer Series presentation on various interesting trends or concepts in the world of technology and democracy. And I am joined by my colleagues, Amy Studdart, the Director of Technology and Democracy at the International Republican Institute, IRI, and Ritika Singh, Program Officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE. And we'll wait just a moment here and let some more people filter in before we jump into the beat of our discussion today, which is on how to build a more democratic future that actually uses the internet. And hello, folks, as you continue to join here, we'll be getting started with our session momentarily. All right, I think we're probably at quorum. I'm sure there'll be some additional people filtering in. So again, welcome one and all to the final NDI Tech Summer Series as we discuss more democratic futures and whether we can actually do something positive with this whole internet thing as we think about digital democracy for the as we go forward in the future here. So again, I'm fortunate to be joined by colleagues and friends from our sister organizations within the National Endowment for Democracy family, Amy Studdart from IRI and Ritika Singh from CIPE. So I think without any further ado, we'll just jump in and get started. So kind of the big picture here is when we think about democracy and technology, it often doesn't seem like it's going very well. You see articles like, will democracy survive the internet? The only people who really seem to be getting it right are the digital authoritarians out there. Places like China and Russia, they have a vision for how the internet can work in modern society. The internet can provide stability. The internet can provide economic growth. Oh, and by the way, it'll bring along with it a healthy dose of surveillance and kind of electoral manipulation to kind of cement authoritarians in the future here. But then when we think about what we end up doing here on the democracy side of the equation, often it just ends up being like, ooh, Facebook can be bad, China is scary, but where's the positive vision for things? Like, is there a way for us to build democracies that actually incorporate technology in a way that makes it better, more responsive, more open, more transparent, and so on? I like to think about how a lot of our democratic institutions that we have today were actually built in a time where messages didn't go faster than horse. Now we have a whole global community. We're all participating over these extraordinary magic windows where we can talk to people from all around the world. But all of our institutions are basically the same. So really interested to have today's conversation and would like to have you all join it as well. So as we're talking here, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. This will be just kind of an informal discussion among friends here, and would love to have you join us as we're talking. So without any further ado here, like Amy, Ritika, why are you all interested in running this sort of unusual program?
So I think, Chris, that you're exactly right. I think what we have is an authoritarian model for what the future will look like that embraces technology to advance state control in a way that can seem appealing to people, right? Reducing crime, increasing social cohesion. There's lots and lots of things about that seem good. We then have the Facebooks and the Googles of the world that are for-profit companies that are trying to make money. And they make consumer products. They're trying to drum up consumer interest and get attention into their products. products. What we don't have is a democratic version of that, right? So we have these two models, the capitalist model and the authoritarian model. We don't really have a model that says, how do we embrace this for democratic participation, to deliver good governance, to create a future that we want to see. And so to my mind, there's sort of two ways of creating that democratic model. One is to say, actually, you know what, the power of democracy is all of this innovation that happens at the grassroots, right? Like we see all of these cool ideas and all of these ways that people are using whatever tools they can to improve their lives and the lives of those around them, and to improve their communities. And then the other model is the like massive public investment model, right? Like the government technology version of things where, you know, we the people is a really good example of that. My sense of how we make this work, how we create a future that is democratic, that does, you know, improve things in a way that we want to see them improved as people rather than as states, is that we need to take those innovations, all of those super cool things that are happening at the grassroots, and then create a democratic framework that's receptive to them. And I think you got to a really good point there toward the end of what you were saying, which is, you know, that our institutions have sort of stayed the same. They haven't really evolved. We've had this massive revolution in the way that people communicate, massive redistribution of power, massive redistribution of access to information. And we've done nothing with it in how our governments work and how our sort of representation works. And so I think that the question is, can we harness all of that energy, all of the demand, all of this sort of innovation that's happening at the grassroots, and then make our government institutions and our political institutions receptive to it so that they change, so that there is a sort of release of power to the masses, essentially in ways that are constructive and helpful. I'll get off my soapbox for now, but I'm sure I will get back onto it at some point.
Awesome, thanks, Amy. Yeah, and Ritika, how about you? How did the things look from CIPE's perspective?
Thanks, Chris and Amy. I think what I'd add from CIPE's perspective is that in order for democracy to really deliver, right? We talk about that, we hear about that, but in order for democracy to really deliver for people as we go into the future, we need to have participation from local businesses and civil society, and really have them be players in in strengthening democratic ideals and norms, right? Like it's not just something that is going to happen without intentional change and intention and really focusing on what people are worried about or concerned about, and we can talk about all the many things that people worry about when they look into the future when it comes to technology. But business is so often a part of creating those fears and then alleviating them. And so from CIPE's perspective, it really is about involving not just the Facebooks and the big tech, like we were talking about, but also getting participation from local businesses to strengthen democratic norms, particularly in like the global South and places where a lot of these conversations aren't at the forefront of people's minds, but should be as we look to move into the future and hopefully chart some kind of positive path. Yeah.
Well, I mean, digitization has just transformed, I suppose, the small market economies in the developing world, like the ability of very, very small entrepreneurs to tap into different types of markets and stuff. Are there some ways in which that can then bridge into a more kind of a more positive, interesting democratic future, ways to get those small market voices to the table, you know, at least in the US domestic context? And I'm sure in a lot of countries we talk a lot about the influence of like big business on politics or on politicians. But are there ways to kind of transform and upend that with the arrival of so many kind of micro entrepreneurs able to engage through the internet? Are they able to help kind of shape democracy as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest challenge that we see, is that so often these local businesses or entrepreneurs or sort of everyday citizens' voices are really drowned out by the big, powerful players. And so this is what we do at CIPE. A lot of what we do is really trying to elevate those small business voices and civil society voices, just so they they have a say in what their future looks like. And you know, certainly there are many ways that we do that, like empowering associations and local business communities and things like that to actually think about how they would want to respond to some of these democratic challenges. But yeah, but that's definitely a big challenge moving forward.
Yeah. So, you know, when we think about this, like, okay, great. We're all agreed we should have, you know, new forms of democracy, better ways to engage with the internet. But how do we surface those ideas? How do we come up with kind of new, clever ways to do it? Or, you know, there's so much innovation and dynamism in, you know, in the private sector and in economic development or in you know, major tech firms. But how do we kind of get good ideas to innovate in the democratic sphere? You know, sometimes people, especially Silicon Valley types, love to talk about how they disrupt things. But, you know, disrupting democracy isn't exactly like a good in and of itself. So how do we tap and surface some of these really interesting new ideas that might be out there?
So I think, you know, this whole concept of disruption and it coming from the private sector, I think, is a sort of a fallacy that has been created in large part by the technology companies as a way of sort of building the mystique around them and talking about how brilliant they are in various different ways. The thing about democracy is that innovation is happening all of the time, right? Like at every single layer, you will see people using whatever they can, whatever tools they have at their disposal to make life better, to advance their goals, to, you know, this is sort of the essence of what, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a driver for people. And so that innovation is there, the motivation is there. At IRI, we've been running something called the Optimists Hour. The idea being that, you know, yes, things can be terrible, but we can work together to make it all better and to improve things rather than just lamenting all of the threats and decay that we see. And there's just all of this incredible stuff that's happening, right? Like you'll see people who are, even from something as simple as using WhatsApp to connect to different tribes and build trust between different tribes in Nigeria, or, you know, in North Macedonia, there's this really cool app called M Community that has just taken the whole country by storm, where they're using it to like properly engage on the issue. Citizens are using it to engage on the issues that they care about, and governments are responding to it. There's this cool organization in Argentina called Bussola Tech that connects communities from across Latin America to talk about these innovations and how they can scale them across the continent. And so there is a lot of innovation there. The question is, like, should we scale it? How do we scale it? And if we should scale it, but generally, how do we support it? How do we say this is the good stuff and we want to see this continue? And there isn't necessarily a set of drivers there at the moment, right? Like, whereas tech companies they have a clear goal. How do we make money? How do we make as much money as possible and increase those numbers on all of these different sheets? For democracy, the questions are much more nebulous, and there's not a clear business model. How do you ensure that these cool organizations have the investment that they need in order to ensure that they're not like constantly being run by volunteers, and that they don't disappear once the one person who was driving them, you know, has to have some other aspect of their life that they're engaging in. So there is a lot there. That innovation is there. We're just not harnessing it yet. And I think that there are ways to do that. I'd also push the conversation a little bit further, because we've really, we focused on like, how do we deliver current democracy better? And one of the things that I've found really interesting as we've been engaging in this project is when you ask people to like dream big and really think about what they want from the world, there's a real massive expansion that you see in people's minds of what democracy can be and the problems that it can solve. And so it's not just necessarily about like one man, one vote, but like, how do we create decision-making architectures that mean that we're properly accounting for environmental issues, that mean that we're properly accounting for animals and, you know, their preferences, and for trees. And it's really, really fascinating to see all of this. The other thing that we hear a lot is the idea of the nation state, right? You know, the nation state was created. The nation state has been the unit of government because we've had to have this geographically based framework for how we understand representation and decision-making structures, because we were limited by that because the technology didn't exist. Now that we have the internet, why is that the unit? Why don't we have communities of interest of, you know, parents around the world who are much more invested in the future of their children versus, you know, older people who are much more invested in ensuring that their knowledge might continue in various different ways. And so I think that there's just so much there to be explored, and there's so much innovative thinking that exists, and we're just not harnessing it because we're so stuck in our old ways.
That's great. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff, Amy, and so provocative. Like, some of this stuff sounds outrageous in some ways. I think was one of your colleagues from Taiwan. You'll know the story exactly, but there's, like, you know, serious proposals like that we should have voting rights for say natural features such as rivers, stuff like that. That they have like human proxies who are supposed to vote in the interests of the natural environment because they, you know, they have interests that, if represented, will do better for society overall. How about you, Ritika? How are you guys over at CIPE looking at these challenges, and how are you going to be kind of surfacing any new ideas or getting the pulse of the world?
I feel like, I was just going to say that I feel like in the States we're very far away from anything like that with rivers and trees. But these are some really interesting ideas. And, you know, I'll just say really quick too, in response to some of the comments that were made, that, you know, it's not just about the antitrust conversations that we kind of are bombarded with in the news and like think about. That's just only one dimension of it, right? In terms of like how to move forward and strengthen trust in some of these technologies. Like, I think that at CIPE, we're thinking about so much more than that. Like, it's not just about demonopolizing the tech industry. It's also about just kind of trying to create processes for communities to engage with and to contribute meaningfully to developing rules or regulations, which don't even exist in a lot of places. And just thinking about alternative business models that reflect democratic values better, or, as you were saying, Chris, like improving accessibility of digital education, or, you know, digitalization trainings and stuff like that. So there's just so many ways to think about this moving forward. But one thing that we're trying to do as we think of different solutions is this questionnaire that I've been working on and that you all have contributed to. But we're sending a questionnaire to a lot of our partners and democratic reformers. And so these are people in the business communities. These are people that are involved in civil society, media, all of our different spheres. And so our partners and academics and other folks that we hear from, some on these issues and some not, but just interested in creating a democratic world, like, they're going to receive this questionnaire and hopefully will help inspire us about what they think the biggest challenges are, and some of the major trends that they're seeing that do inspire them, and some of the things that they hope will describe the future of a tech-enabled democracy. So I'm so excited about this survey, and I think that it's going to yield a lot of interesting information just in terms of like what trends in digital governance give people hope for the future.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I mean, it's such an audacious idea to try and really tap into, you know, thousands of voices from across the global South and make sure that they're included in these conversations. Yeah, I think there is a vibrant subfield of speculative futurist thinking. It's kind of a bit of a niche, but an established way of thinking about things in the US and some other kind of advanced economies, But I think very rarely does that include voices from the global South or a lot of the places that our organizations work. So that survey is, I think, going to be a tremendous way to get at that. At NDI, we're really excited to be partnering with a group called the Institute for the Future. This will surprise you, but they work on futurist stuff. With them, we're going to be working on developing a series of kind of futurist visioning sessions, kind of like focus groups that we'll be running with civic and political activists, also again across the global South, to try and tap into some of these things. As you mentioned earlier, Amy, when people start being able to think about this stuff, imagine about this stuff, then there really are some interesting ideas that just can spark and get people thinking creatively about how the world could be different, and how we could really build something that's more interesting and exciting, rather than just being in a defensive crouch, bemoaning the erosion of democracy. So yeah, and I think, for us, when we're thinking about this, one of the really interesting ways to do it, like sometimes, let's be honest, those of us on the call here, we're kind of political nerds. Most of you watching probably are as well, right? We're people who think long and earnestly about this sort of stuff, and might write thoughtful and rather dull papers on the topic or something like that. But that's not really the way that you inspire a lot of folks. So it was interesting, Ritika, talking with your colleagues recently. It sounds like you're looking at some more creative approaches to imagining the future as well. I wonder if you want to tell the group a little bit about some of that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think this is such an important thing when we're trying to inspire people to think about what the future might look like and what democracy could look like with technology that isn't all just a house of horrors. How do we really capture people's attention? It's not papers or events or lectures, really. It's the importance, I think it's the importance of engaging artists and entertainers and lots of different people that are in the creative sphere. And so we are trying to kind of tap into that a little bit. And so another part of what we're working on is something that we are calling an anthology now. And it's basically different contributors that we're hoping to solicit to write something or produce something or do a poem or, just basically talk about the future or things that are challenges and possible solutions in ways that are interesting and inspiring and aren't purely academic. So I think that is a challenge, frankly, for the democracy community, is how to talk about some of these things in ways that that capture the broader appeal. So for instance, we had in a separate project, but I hope to do something similar with the anthology. We had someone do a series of 10 poems leading up to an election about electoral freedom, about getting out to vote. And those were really, really cool. And I hope to do something similar with the anthology, but we're looking at everything. Honestly, we're throwing everything at the wall and trying to see what sticks. So we came up with like a comic book, and certainly we've talked about, Chris, you and I have talked about like artists and visual art even. So it's hard to communicate some of these concepts in some of these forms, but if we can try and do it, I think it'd be really cool.
Yeah, no, that's such neat stuff. And like, I'm a sucker for sci-fi literature myself. So you're talking my language there. It's but that stuff can be so, it can help people imagine a very different place to be in. And so like, I mean, the word utopia comes from a fiction novel by, was it Thomas More, hundreds of years ago. But this idea that you can dream up something better, and with all its ridiculousness that any of these scenarios may have, at least they can help people imagine a different sort of thing. We're looking forward to doing some of that at NDI as well. Right now we're thinking that we're going to be commissioning special issues with a number of speculative fiction or sci-fi fantasy magazines across the global South. So like have a call for like, hey, give us your stories about this sort of stuff. And so I think it'll be really interesting to get some of those ideas circulating or germinating, or visual art, or I don't know, interpretive dance for what democracy could look like. I think, well, that sounds a little whimsical. There's a long tradition of that in international development, whether it's supporting street theater or radio dramas or stuff like that. There's a way to tie fiction to people's everyday lives in different sorts of ways. So some interesting questions coming in over the chat here. Please keep them coming, folks. But Noor asked a question, can we deduce that there's no possible democracy without a cyber democracy? What do you guys say to that?
I mean, I think that that's absolutely right. The idea that we would just completely ignore the fact that this radical technological shift has happened and not adjust our political institutions is I think has been proven to be utterly nonsense as a framework over the last 10 years. And, I think that this is one of the reasons that right now it sort of feels that we're on the back foot and that we're losing, right? Because the authoritarians have said, wow, this gives us so much more capacity for control. Let's embrace all of it. And then they go forward and they say, they're able to go out into the rest of the world and say, look, we are the system of the future because we have embraced these technologies in ways that deliver better. It's completely absurd to me that we are better able to hold a restaurant accountable or tell a restaurant that we don't like their food or we saw a rat than we are our own government that we pay for every single day and that we elect all of the time. I also wanted to pick up on something that's been coming up throughout this conversation here, which is this idea of the global South and including them in the conversation. I think that another paradigm shift that we're going to have to embrace over the next little stretch is the idea that we are no longer, our organizations were set up as democracy assistance organizations. The premise of that was that the US is an established democracy, that there was a lot of thinking that was done here about how democracies should work, and that we should go out and share those lessons with the rest of the world. That was founded on, I think you can agree or disagree with this statement, but I think founded on a basically good motivation that said, this is the biggest, most successful democratic experiment that there has been. We should go forth and share those experiences. I think that we really need now to flip that on its head. And instead consider that we are in a community of democracy, in a community of democracies around the world, and of democratic actors, right? In some places that are authoritarian, you see democratic innovations happening as well. And democratic commitments happening, and start to accept and genuinely believe and embrace the fact that some of the most impressive democratic innovation, some of the most impressive ways in which technology is used to deliver on democratic goods, to advance, Enlightenment principles, et cetera, are going to come from elsewhere. And we should be receptive to that. And then we should also, share those best practices with the rest of the world. So we sort of laugh about the efficacy of networks, but I think that one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this whole project and the collaboration between CIPE, NDI, and IRI is just this idea that there's all of this great stuff out there in the world. And if we can connect all of the people, not all of the people, but a bunch of the people who are thinking about it, either from an artistic standpoint or from a political standpoint or from a small business standpoint, if we can connect all of those people, we can start to sort of create a movement, right, that is genuinely global and really embraces just the incredible spirit that a global democracy, by which I do not mean, actual global democratic institutions, but a global democratic movement can create.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, but in some ways, why not like global democracy? There's interesting comments about the nation state, and let's see. It was Ben Damon mentioned how the printing press was one of the progenitors of the nation state, and and so many of our problems are truly transnational, truly global, like the idea that we can develop different communities of interest or practice, and that we can that we have the potential to manage different things in different ways. When we face truly global crises such as climate change, pandemic, stuff like that, that do not respect nation state boundaries. Maybe democracy needs to be a little bit more able to deal with that, stuff like that. So, interesting comment from Ben here about how planning is being replaced by coordination. And it's certainly true that coordination is something that traditional democratic institutions, international bureaucracies of the day don't seem particularly good at. So Ben's asking is, does a future of democracy depend upon building new kinds or more hyper coordinated institutions? So any thoughts or responses to that idea?
I think I really like that. And planning in and of itself, I love planning. I'm a big planner, but there's a version of central planning that is intrinsically authoritarian, right? It's this idea that says, we in the center know what's best, and so we will put in place a plan, and then everyone else is supposed to follow it. And this is the big, not necessarily benefit of authoritarianism, but it's what seems good about authoritarianism. It's what seems appealing about it. Democracy is an exercise in coordination and sort of compromise. And it's, all of these different nodes. The idea is that everything is supposed to bubble up from the bottom, right? All of the ideas bubble up from the bottom. And then hopefully we come up with something at the top that means that all of that stuff gets implemented. And this is why intrinsically the internet should be good for democracy. It should facilitate that coordination. It should ensure that information is being distributed in ways that mean that the people who are closest to the problems or closest to the opportunities have the information that they need in order to be able to, make decisions about whatever it is that they care about, and then that they can coordinate with others to do the same thing. The problem is that our system doesn't reflect that. Our system reflects a version of information flows and of coordination that is still very much based on geography, right? That says all of the people who are involved in the coordination need to be in the same place, geographical place. And so the capital is in DC, and then you have state capitals and you have neighborhood commissions. But actually, a lot of the time, the stuff that people most care about, the things that really get them riled up or excited aren't necessarily geographically located. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes, it's the environment, or it's space, or it's whatever it is. And so creating ways that mean that people can engage with those issues, I think is sort of how we get there. And that's a coordination question, and it's an information distribution question.
Yeah, it's such a great example, because the physicality of a capital is based on the idea that you need to have decision makers who get together in the same place, because how else are they supposed to talk to each other? Well, here we are having a virtual conference with folks I know from all over the world joining us here. So of course it's possible to do it differently. Now, somebody who lives in DC and actually likes the town quite a bit, it's not a swamp. Okay, it is a swamp, but not that kind of swamp. I would be sad if the need for the capital evaporated, but it's such a 19th century concept. You don't need to have people in the same place to do this stuff anymore. So yeah, Ritika, any interesting ideas that have popped up from discussions you all have had to date? Or I think it's quite interesting how the future of markets is kind of changing these dynamics as well. So curious about anything that y'all have seen that might be interesting to share.
Yeah, thanks. I think the only thing that I would add to the conversation that we just had is that, it's really about trying to provide a protected and safer environment. Like when we talk about how to strengthen democracy or tech-enabled democracy, it's about trying to give people who want to mobilize, who want to participate, who want to leverage technology for all their different ideas, or as Amy was saying, people's different things that rile people up are different, and they're different solutions to public policy challenges. It's really about being able to provide that protected space which I feel like is the reason that people are so concerned and up in arms now, is because it doesn't feel like you're actually protected online. It feels like it's this insane, like, Wild West almost, and it shouldn't be. And I think that's going to be something that we really need to think more carefully about if we want to strengthen democracy.
That's great. Yeah. So just put a question in the chat here, but like anyone with any interesting ideas that you've seen, thoughts that you've had, however crazy, be curious to get any thoughts that folks have out there for what the future of democracy could look like, and also to build my my summer reading list here. If anyone's read any great sci-fi or fantasy or any other books that really are kind of imaginative for a better or different future, I'd love to hear about them. One pitch I'll throw out there right away is there's a wonderful author, Malka Older, who has a series that starts with a book called Infomocracy. And she has done, I think, quite a unique job of imagining a radically different sort of future that is highly democratic, but where the nation state has, by and large, disappeared. And people are in highly autonomous, self-organizing groups of 100,000, and that there's a kind of a common law across everything, but that generally within those enclaves, people can do, they set their own local laws. So, and it's all predicated on concepts of information and communication that are only possible in a digital age. So love to hear any other questions or thoughts out there, or for my fellow panelists here, any things that you'd like to share. Noor asks if we think the Matrix movie is still relevant today. First of all, of course it's still relevant because they all look so cool. And what's the point of the future if we can't all look like badasses dressed in leather? So hope we get there eventually. But the kind of that sort of that fear of AI and the machines taking over is, I think, an interesting negative version of things, and so we can always try and imagine, use that as sort of the negative version, the Terminator, another version of the fear of computers and AI in the future. But yeah, would love any other ideas that people had. Yeah, Ritika, you want to tell us about the one you shared?
Yeah, I just put a link to a book in the chat. That's one that my colleague read recently when she was at the beach this summer and recommended. And it seems like I have not read it, so I'm recommending it at the behest of someone else who highly recommended it. But it's basically just a sci-fi book trying to think about a livable future in 2051. And so it's definitely on my list.
That's cool.
I'll recommend a couple that I read a little while back to this question about how we organize and think about information, but also the rights and contributions of potential other creatures and living things. So one is this wonderful book, Semiosis, which is, alien world. There are human-like creatures, but there's also this hyper-intelligent bamboo. And it's just a really interesting exploration of what kind of information and coordination and power a bamboo would have, right? Looking at things like root structures and the kinds of information that root structures would gather, and what it would mean if you lived for a long time, and what it would mean if you communicated, if you only had certain forms of communication. Another one I'll recommend, but I don't want to ruin the plot. I've slightly ruined the plot of Semiosis. I'm really sorry. Another one I'll recommend, and I won't ruin the plot, is Children of Time, which looks at what would happen if you put the seeds of life on a planet and a different kinds of intelligence evolved, and what that would mean for power structures, and again, how communication would happen, and what ambitions would look like. And yeah, you should read both of them. They're both mind-boggling, life-changing, wonderful books.
That's awesome. Yeah, so if you have any other suggestions, please throw them in the chat there. Noor asks, is information asymmetry a lack of cyber democracy? And so if I'm understanding the question right, I think, you know, the part of the democratic future that we would, that at least that I imagine, I think that we've been talking about, is the idea that everyone has access to accurate information all the time. That's actually a big premise in the Infomocracy series that I mentioned. You know, that's certainly not the world that we sit in now today. And so we're going to hand wave ourselves past that, because today we're relentlessly focused on the positive. But you know, it does imply that somehow a democratic future means that we've dealt with our challenges of misinformation, disinformation, manipulation, and so on, because that we have to, for people to have an informed electorate, you know, that's making good enough choices frequently enough percentage of the time, you know, the information has to be accurate. So yeah, Ritika, Amy, other thoughts, kind of comments? Open floor, open conversation here.
One thing that I just wanted to raise while we have a few more minutes is, you know, Chris, you were asking for like wild ideas that have come up for, you know, what a democratic future might look like. And I don't know, some ideas that I've seen floating around as we've been thinking about the questionnaire and thinking about the anthology is, so two things. One is like really a future in which you can own and monetize your personal data, right? So like as a consumer, you can sell your data for ads. That's one that I think, you know, people say would strengthen democracy, and obviously, and others vehemently disagree. Then another idea that I've come across that we've been thinking about is like, can we see a future where we would have like dedicated funding streams to reduce or mitigate harms that are caused by technology? So like, for instance, would we ever see a future where we have a fund that supports individuals who are impacted by like data breaches, or we've been talking about the environment, you know, Bitcoin mining and like other data mining is horribly environmentally horrible for the environment. So would there be like dedicated funding streams to reduce those harms? And I would just be curious to hear what you all or some of the participants think about some of those potential solutions.
Yeah, I think that it's such an important point. That there's a sort of underlying point there, which is, where do we put our money, right? Where do we put our resources? And it's such an important question, and it feels like, you know, government budgets have sort of stayed the same. There hasn't been a massive rejiggering of where it is that we put public money. It's sort of all been moved around the margins, and any new funds come out of increases in funds, rather than us looking at a completely changed world and saying, actually, these are the spaces where we need to be putting public money given the reality of today. And again, I think that this is like trying to build a new world on top of an old infrastructure with a bunch of vested interests in it has just proven to be incredibly difficult and really impossible. And so I would almost take all of that a little bit further and say, like, all of these institutions that we have, all of these frameworks that we have, all of these ideas that created the democracy and democratic systems that we have today, there's no reason that they need to be the way that they are, right? Like, we created them. We can just as easily create something else. These are all things that came out of people's brains. And so when we think about the future, when we think about what we want the world to be, yes, it can be tempting we should learn lessons from the past. We should certainly not throw everything out that we've learned, but I do think that we should be like much more creative and say, actually, you know, this is what we want the world to look like, and here are the structures and institutions and norms and rules that will get us there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, I just find this stuff so interesting and exciting, and it's a nice tonic to counteract the general doom and gloom of the era. And you know, we're optimists. That doesn't mean that we're Pollyanna-ish. Like, Facebook has been highly destructive to different forms of democracy. Like, digital authoritarians are making huge inroads around the world, but you know, we should fight the negatives, but also try and think about a more positive vision for the future to go to. So this program is, this Democratic Futures program is one that's working, that's a joint effort between NDI, CIPE, and IRI. Watch this space. We're going to continue doing stuff here over the next year or more. I'm very excited for, Ritika mentioned an anthology that we'll come out with. It'll probably be bridging, you know, think tank, political, artistic, and global South focus group visions on what the future can be for a more positive version of digital democracy going forward here. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining. Appreciate your questions and thoughts. Amy, Ritika, any last comments or closing remarks?
Just huge thanks to you and to NDI and to everyone that is here today. Thank you.
Great. Well,
I would just
thank you all
echo
so much
that.
for.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ritika. Thank you, Amy. Thanks all for joining us, and thanks so much to Summer and Elizabeth, who've been managing the not just today's conversation, but all of the summer series here. Huge shout out to the two of them. This is the capstone of what's been a long and interesting, I think, series of talks on a lot of different topics. You'll be able to find them on NDI's YouTube channel if you want to dig into any of the other stuff, and we'll all see you in the future. Bye all.